Most of my life, African masks made me uncomfortable, not because I understood them, not because I had studied them, not because I knew the history. They made me uncomfortable because of what I believed they represented. When I was young, I looked at African masks and saw something dark, something connected to evil. The symbolism felt threatening. Actually, I'm lying, I didn't know about symbolism. The spirituality surrounding it felt something to avoid rather than something to understand. And for years I never questioned why. I assumed those feelings belonged to me. But the older I became, the more I learned about African art, African history, and the lasting effects of colonization. Slowly, the realization began to emerge. The masks were never the problem. The stories attached to them was. For generations, Africans were taught to hate parts of themselves. Indigenous beliefs were dismissed as primitive. Traditional spirituality was labeled as evil. Our cultural practices were pushed aside and replaced with foreign interpretations of what was acceptable and, in quotes, worthy of respect. The most powerful form of colonization is not the occupation of land. It is the occupation of perception. Because once a person begins to view themselves through someone else's lens, they no longer need to be controlled from the outside. The work has already been done. Looking back, I realized that I inherited a perception. I wasn't looking at the masks themselves. I was looking at centuries of conditioning. And that realization became the foundation for this series. At first I thought I was creating artworks about African masks, but the longer I worked, the more I understood that the masks were only the surface. What I was really creating was a record of unlearning. Each piece became an opportunity to sit with something I had unconsciously rejected, to examine an inherited fear, to question a belief I had never chosen for myself. What happens when the fear is observed instead of obeyed? What happens when inherited assumptions are challenged? What happens when we stop accepting every belief as our own? As I worked bead by bead, something unexpected happened. The masks began to change, or at least it felt that way. The imagery I once viewed through a lens of fear began revealing itself as an expression of identity, of memory, and cultural continuity. And of course, the mask hadn't changed. I had. And there is a certain irony in that. The same imagery that once made me uncomfortable became the same imagery I chose to spend hundreds of hours creating. And bit by bit, I found myself building the very thing I had spent years distancing myself from. And somewhere within that repetition, something shifted. The masks stopped feeling like symbols of fear. They became symbols of inquiry, symbols of understanding, and eventually symbols of connection. And I hope they're going to connect with you as well. The work became more than an exploration of African culture. It became evidence that healing often begins the moment we become curious about the things we were taught to reject. And this series is it's not an attempt to romanticize the past. It's not even an invitation for anyone to adopt a particular belief system. It is an invitation to look again, to question, to examine, to ask where our perception comes from, and whether they genuinely belong to us. Because when we inherit a worldview, We rarely notice that it was inherited. We simply call it truth. And these 5 masks represent 5 conversations with that idea, 5 opportunities to challenge an assumption. Reminders that reclaiming culture often begins by reclaiming perception. The masks never needed to be reclaimed. They were never lost. What needed to be reclaimed was my relationship to them. And through that process, a small part of myself returned as well. The mask never changed. I did.